There is a farm account book sitting in a small archive in Jackson County, North Carolina. The cover is water-stained leather, cracked along the spine. The handwriting inside is careful, slightly uneven, the kind of lettering a man taught himself after the workday ended. Page after page records transactions in a world that had almost no cash in it. Entries for salt purchased, corn tallied by the bushel, hogs weighed before slaughter, shoulders and hams cataloged by the pound, jars of apple butter counted for winter, credit extended to neighbors who would repay it in labor come spring plowing. The entries span decades, from the 1840s into the 1890s, and what they reveal, quietly, without drama, is something that most Americans today have completely forgotten existed. These mountain families were not simply surviving. They had engineered something, not with blueprints or formal design, but through generations of accumulated knowledge, failure, correction, and refinement. They had built a system. Every structure on that farm served a purpose that connected to every other structure. Every animal fed something beyond itself. Every crop was planted with its secondary use already in mind. Every skill one family member mastered reduced the number of times a coin would need to change hands. The goal, never stated but always understood, was to reach a point where the outside world, its prices, its droughts in distant markets, its economic panics, could not reach into the holler and starve you. They came remarkably close to achieving it. If what you're watching right now speaks to that part of you that senses something important has been lost, if you watch on a television in your living room and you find yourself leaning forward at stories like this one, we'd ask you to consider sharing this video with someone who would feel it the same way you do. Not just subscribing, but sharing. That's what helps this channel reach people. That's what keeps these stories alive. Now, let's go back to those mountains. The southern Appalachians in the 19th century were not simply a geographic location. They were an isolation. The ridges here do not run parallel and gentle the way they do farther north. They fold and tumble into one another, creating coves and hollows and creek drainages so enclosed that a man could live his entire life within 10 miles of where he was born and never feel the absence of the wider world. The mountains stretch from southern New York all the way to northern Georgia and Mississippi, an unbroken spine of ancient rock that geologists believe to be some of the oldest exposed terrain on Earth, worn down by hundreds of millions of years of weather into rounded forest-covered forms that look almost soft from a distance. Up close, they are anything but. By the mid-1800s, the prime valley farmland along river bottoms was claimed, and later arrivals pushed up into the coves. The bench terraces cut into hillsides, the narrow heads of creeks where sunlight arrived late in the morning and left early in the afternoon. A farm carved out of that kind of terrain had limits. The plowable acreage was small. The growing season, depending on elevation, could be no more than 4 months. What frost left undone, the topography finished. You could not simply plant more. You had to think differently. You had to think in systems. The vast majority of settlers who had flooded into these mountains after the Revolutionary War were Scotch-Irish, descendants of people from the border counties of England and Scotland, and from the lowland parishes of Scotland, many of whom had spent a generation in Ulster before crossing the Atlantic. These were not people who romanticized hardship. They had seen famine in Ireland, religious persecution in Scotland, and the indifferent brutality of indentured servitude in the coastal colonies. When they pushed west into the mountains and the ridges closed behind them, what they built was not a retreat from the world. It was a fortress against the world's worst possibilities. Federal records from the late 19th century note that most mountaineers lived self-sufficiently, growing corn and raising hogs, isolated from each other and the outside world by the region's many parallel ridges. That description is accurate as far as it goes, but it misses the architecture behind the isolation. It misses the fact that corn and hogs were not simply two things these families grew. They were the twin pillars of an interconnected structure so precisely calibrated to the conditions of mountain life that removing any single element caused the others to strain and wobble. To understand how Appalachian families came so close to true self-sufficiency, you have to understand how the pieces of that system locked together. A typical cove farm in Jackson County, or Madison County in North Carolina, or up in the river drainages of Pocahontas County in West Virginia, might encompass 30 to 60 acres total. But of that, perhaps 10 to 15 acres were genuinely workable as cropland. The rest was forested ridge, steep hillside, creek bottom, subject to flooding, or rocky outcropping. This was not a deficiency to be overcome. It was a resource to be managed. The forest was not wilderness to be cleared. It was the farm's lumberyard, its medicine cabinet, its hunting ground, its fuel supply, and, in ways that took generations to fully appreciate, its insurance policy against the years when the crops failed. Families that knew their woodlot, knew which trees were coming down naturally, which stumps would rot into useful crumbles of humus for the garden, had an advantage that could not be purchased at any price. The garden occupied the choicest, most sheltered ground, ideally a south-facing slope where sunlight lingered longest and cold air, which drains downhill on still nights, settled elsewhere. Corn was the anchor. Not the sweet corn of summer tables, but field corn. Varieties like Bloody Butcher and Hickory King, with deep-colored kernels and dense, starchy flesh that dried on the stalk in October and could be stored indefinitely in a dry crib. A bushel of dried field corn weighed approximately 56 pounds. A family might harvest 300 to 500 bushels in a good year. Some of it would feed the family through winter in the form of cornmeal ground at the nearest grist mill. Some of it would feed the hogs. And some of the surplus, beyond what people and animals needed, would be converted into something considerably more valuable than grain. We will come back to that. Alongside corn grew what mountain families called their sass garden, the vegetables that provided the bulk of the family's nutrition from late spring through fall, and whose preserved forms carried them through winter. Beans were essential. Not just any beans, but specific varieties that had been handed down so long within families that they carried names. Greasy cut shorts, October beans, turkey craw, mortgage lifter, names that encoded their history and their purpose. Beans were strung on thread and hung from rafters to dry into what mountain people called leather breeches, a form of preservation that required nothing but air and time. Sweet potatoes were dug in late September and stored in dry conditions, bedded in straw, at temperatures just above freezing. Pumpkins and winter squash cured in a dry corner of the barn. Irish potatoes, turnips, and cabbage went into the root cellar. The root cellar itself was a feat of passive engineering that most modern people underestimate completely. Dug into a north-facing hillside or beneath the cabin floor, it exploited a basic physical principle that soil temperature at a depth of 4 to 6 feet remains remarkably stable year-round, hovering between 40 and 55 degrees Fahrenheit across most of Appalachia, regardless of what the air above does. No mechanical refrigeration, no electricity, no moving parts. The earth itself maintained the temperature. A well-constructed root cellar, with drainage to control humidity, ventilation slits to moderate the air without letting in warmth, and shelving that kept stored food off the ground, could hold root vegetables, apples, canned goods, and dairy products from October through April with minimal spoilage. Families who understood the system kept careful tallies of what they had stored and how much they consumed each week, rationing precisely so that the last jar of preserved beans came off the shelf about the same time the first spring greens appeared in the garden. In lean years, that precision was the only thing standing between a family and genuine starvation. Apples occupied a category of their own in the mountain farm system. The old varieties grown in Appalachian orchards, limber twig, horse apple, sheep nose, winesap, were not the thin-skinned supermarket fruit of today. They were dense, tart, highly acidic, and built for keeping. A limber twig apple harvested in October could sit in a cool cellar until February without rotting. The high acid content that made some of these varieties nearly inedible when fresh was precisely what made them durable in storage and ideal for fermentation. Apple cider pressed in late fall and allowed to work naturally in wooden barrels provided families with a safe, mildly alcoholic beverage through winter, at a time when surface water from springs, while generally cleaner at mountain elevation than in lowland towns, was not always reliably safe to drink. Apple butter slow-cooked in great iron kettles over outdoor fires in October, sealed in crocks, was a calorie-dense preserved food that cost nothing but time and labor. Nothing from the apple was wasted. The pumice left from pressing cider was fed to the hogs. The hog. Here is where the system becomes extraordinary, and where the gap between what these families understood and what we have forgotten grows widest. A single mature hog, properly raised and processed, provided more than just meat. It provided lard for cooking, for waterproofing leather, and for making soap. It provided salt-cured hams that could hang in a smokehouse for a year without refrigeration. It provided sausage packed in jars under its own rendered fat, sealed by heat and grease rather than pressure or electricity, that would keep through the winter on a cool shelf. It provided head cheese made from the skull and feet, boiled, seasoned, pressed into a firm loaf that was sliced cold and eaten well into January. It provided cracklings, the crunchy residue left from rendering lard, that were folded into cornbread batter to add fat and flavor. Essentially nothing from a properly processed Appalachian hog was discarded. The timing of hog slaughter was itself a piece of embedded knowledge so specific that mountain people had entire bodies of belief and observation built around it. The killing had to happen in cold weather, late November or early December in most of the region, when temperatures stayed consistently below freezing overnight. The cold air was not merely convenient, it was functionally necessary. Without refrigeration, a hog slaughtered in warm weather would begin to spoil faster than it could be processed. The cold acted as the farm's natural refrigerator, slowing decomposition long enough for the multiple-day process of butchering, salting, smoking, lard rendering, sausage making, and canning to be completed. Mountain people watched the weather with an intensity that is difficult to fully appreciate today. A warm spell in late November could mean a hog killed and largely wasted. The knowledge of when to kill, the reading of cold fronts, of certain wind directions, of the way frost formed on particular mornings, was practical, life or death meteorology carried in the body, not in any book. The day of the killing itself was communal. Neighbors arrived before first light. A fire had been burning since long before dawn, heating 2 or more large cast iron washpots of water to scalding temperature, hot enough to loosen the bristle from the hog's skin, but not so hot that it set the hair follicles and made scraping impossible. Getting that water to the correct temperature, by feel and experience, with no thermometer, was a skill. The women began rendering lard in iron kettles as the men were still butchering. The cracklins were cooked out, pressed, and saved. The hams and shoulders were rubbed thoroughly with salt, worked into every crevice, around every bone, and carried to the smokehouse. The meat was then laid on shelves or hung from rafters and cured for weeks, sometimes with a slow hickory smoke kept burning inside the sealed structure. Smokehouses were typically constructed of rough lumber with dirt floors, tightly enclosed sides to exclude insects, and no ceiling beyond the roof, so the smoke could rise and circulate freely through the hanging meat. The combination of salt curing and hickory smoke worked through 2 different mechanisms simultaneously. The salt drew moisture from the meat and created an environment inhospitable to bacterial growth. The smoke deposited antimicrobial compounds from the burning wood, phenols, aldehydes, acids, that penetrated the surface of the meat and further slowed spoilage. Together, these 2 processes could preserve a ham hanging in a cool smokehouse for 12 months or longer without any form of refrigeration whatsoever. Mountain families knew this not as chemistry, but as fact, confirmed by generations of observation. It was a mountain custom to share portions of fresh meat with neighbors along the creek on slaughter day. A family killing 2 hogs would send portions of fresh tenderloin to 4 or 5 households nearby, understanding that those households would return the favor when their killing day came. This was not charity. It was rational insurance in a world without cash to purchase anything frozen or preserved. Fresh meat spoiled too quickly for any single family to eat before it turned. By distributing it and receiving in return, the neighborhood as a unit could rotate access to fresh protein through the killing season without waste. Individual surplus converted into community resilience. This pattern repeated itself across almost every dimension of the Appalachian homestead system. A family with a working grist mill on a fast-running creek segment ground corn not only for themselves, but for neighbors, taking a portion of the grain as their fee. A family with a particularly productive apple orchard shared press time in October, receiving labor in return. The skills and structures distributed across a community of 10 or 15 families created a redundant, resilient network that no single family could have maintained alone. The spring house was another piece of this architecture. A small stone structure built over or beside a cold freshwater spring, where the constant flow of 45 to 50-degree water kept the interior cool and humid. Crocks of butter, fresh milk, and soft cheeses could be kept in a spring house for days longer than they would survive in the open air. Meat that needed to cool quickly after slaughter could be submerged in the spring run. It was, in essence, a passive refrigerator powered entirely by the hydrological cycle of the mountain. Groundwater that had percolated through stone and soil for weeks, emerging at a temperature that varied barely 5 degrees across the entire year. A single-family dairy cow produced milk, consumed fresh, skimmed for cream, churned into butter, and cultured into soft cheeses and clabber. The buttermilk left after churning fed the hogs. The whey drained from cheese-making fed the hogs. The hogs produced manure shoveled onto the garden. The garden produced fodder crops and vegetable scraps that fed the hogs. The fat rendered from the hogs produced lard used to preserve the sausage. The sausage sustained the family through winter. Every circle closed. Every waste stream from one process became an input for another. The system had an elegance to it that industrial agriculture would not rediscover, partially and with great technological expense, for another century and a half. Then there was corn whiskey. And here is where something essential about the nature of this system becomes visible. Because moonshine was not simply a vice or even a tradition. It was a financial mechanism. It was the part of the system that converted physical abundance into economic access. A mountain farm operated largely outside the cash economy. Most transactions happened through barter, through labor exchange, through the circulation of goods in kind. But some things could not be bartered for. Salt, the essential preservative without which the entire meat-curing system failed, had to be purchased. Gunpowder for hunting, iron for tools. A bushel of corn, weighing 56 pounds, sold for roughly 30 to 40 cents at market in the mid-19th century. Assuming a family could get it there, which often they could not, over the rutted mountain tracks that became impassable rivers of mud in spring and ice in winter. That same bushel of corn, converted into 2.5 to 3 gallons of whiskey, was worth $1 or more per gallon at point of sale. The mathematics were not subtle. Federal records confirmed that for many families, moonshine was the only cash income available in a subsistence-dominated mountain economy. Abraham Lincoln had signed an excise tax on distilled spirits in 1862 to fund the Civil War, beginning at 20 cents per gallon and rising to $2 per gallon by 1865. For mountain families who had been distilling their surplus corn since the Scotch-Irish immigrants of the 18th century brought the practice with them, this tax was not simply an inconvenience. It was an assault on the economic logic of their survival. The mountain response was not submission. It was concealment. Stills moved deeper into the hollows, to places where the ridge terrain would disperse the smoke before it rose above the tree line, where cold creek water could condense the distillate without a constructed cooling system. where the sound of running water masked the bubble and hiss of the operation. The knowledge of where to build a still that would not be found, the reading of terrain, water flow, and sight lines became its own expertise, passed quietly from one generation to the next. Revenue agents made periodic raids. Stills were smashed, barrels shot through, but the terrain was almost always on the side of the moonshiner. And so the system persisted, decade after decade, quietly converting surplus corn into the cash that purchased the salt, that preserved the meat, that fed the family through winter. Every piece connected to every other piece. What held all of this together was something that has no adequate modern translation. It was not simply skill. It was not simply tradition. It was something closer to a living understanding of the relationships between things. Mountain farmers did not think of their corn and their hogs, and their smokehouse, and their root cellar, and their springhouse, and their still as separate categories. They thought of them as a single organism, each part drawing on and supporting every other part, the whole far more resilient than any individual element could be alone. This kind of integrated systemic understanding was not taught in any formal sense. It was absorbed through years of working alongside the people who held it. A man who understood why you let the hog fatten on corn for 60 days before slaughter. That the corn diet softened the fat in a specific way that made lard render more cleanly. Understood something about the relationship between feed, fat chemistry, and culinary utility that no manual could have conveyed as efficiently. A woman who knew which bean variety dried best on the vine, which apple kept longest in the cellar, and exactly how much salt per pound of pork shoulder the smokehouse required for a 12-month cure, held in her memory a library assembled across generations of trial and consequence. The consequences of getting it wrong were not abstract. They were hunger early in the spring, when the cellar was empty and the garden had not yet produced. Older accounts from late 19th and early 20th century Appalachia record the phenomenon mountain people called the starving time. The period in late winter, usually February into March, when the preserved foods from the previous fall were depleted and the new season's growth had not yet appeared. Families who had miscalculated their stores, who had shared too generously in November, who had lost a portion of their cellar goods to a seal failure or a flooding spring, faced these weeks with dread that is difficult to translate into the terms of modern life. The knowledge that kept the system working was not merely practical. It was survival critical in a way that demands a degree of respect modern people rarely give it. Because today, we have almost entirely lost it, not the information. Some of it survives in archives and old cookbooks and the careful work of historians and organizations like the Museum of Appalachia in Norris, Tennessee, which has preserved hundreds of structures and artifacts from the mountain homestead world. Not even the skills, entirely. There are people in these mountains today who can still split a rail fence or render lard or read the sky before a storm with the accuracy their great-grandparents had. But the system, the integrated, interlocking web of relationships between land, animal, food preservation, community exchange, and economic survival, that system has not survived. What survives are fragments, isolated practices stripped of the context that gave them meaning. That farm account book in Jackson County records its last entry sometime in the 1890s. By then, the railroads were beginning to reach the mountains. Timber companies were arriving, buying up ridgeland at prices that seemed extraordinary to people who had never thought of land in terms of its sale value, only its use value. Within 2 generations, the great majority of Appalachian families had shifted from the integrated homestead system to a cash wage economy, working in mines, in textile mills, in logging operations. The root cellars were still dug sometimes, the smokehouses still stood, but the system that had made those structures necessary, that had given them meaning and their place in the annual rhythm of mountain life, was coming apart at the seams. For decades after Appalachian families had entered the cash economy, old habits persisted in isolated corners. Certain bean varieties still dried on certain rafters. Certain men still read the approach of cold fronts in the way their fathers had. Old smokehouses still stood in yard corners, unused now, their hickory-stained walls holding the ghost of a smell that the current generation could not quite identify, but somehow associated with something they wished they understood. The mountains that form the walls of those families' world are still there. The ridges of the southern Appalachians still fold in on themselves the same way they did in 1850. The cold air still pools in the cove floors on clear October nights, frosting the corn stalks the same week it always has. The springs that fed those spring houses still emerge from the hillsides at 48 degrees, constant, indifferent to the centuries passing above them. What those families understood, that resilience is not a product to be purchased but a web of relationships to be built slowly, maintained carefully, and understood deeply, is something the mountains themselves have not forgotten, even if almost everyone who once lived among them has. The system they built was not romantic. It was real, tested against actual cold, actual hunger, actual mortality. And for the families who understood it fully, in all its interlocking complexity, it held.